5:42 a.m., December 3, 1963, in front of Mosque No. 7, at the corner of 116th Street and Lenox Avenue. Eugene Walker, the night shift street sweeper, was gathering trash when he froze. Right in front of him was a half-burned cross, its red embers still smoldering. Beneath it hung a black-skinned doll by the neck, the rope cutting deep into its plastic throat. Pinned to its chest was a piece of cardboard with red letters. "We know where you are." Eugene stood stunned. He had left Georgia to escape the sight of black men hanging from trees. Yet here, right in the middle of Harlem, he was witnessing that same ritual, not with a real person, but the message was unchanged, and everyone knew who it was meant for. Malcolm X. Eugene ran to the nearby payphone, his hands shaking so badly he had to dial twice. The New York Police Department, NYPD, arrived at 6:01 a.m. Two detectives, John Mulroney and Frank Doyle, stepped out of the car, looked at the cross and the doll for a few seconds, and both fell silent. The silence of men who understood they were standing before something that could not be taken lightly. Doyle bent down to pick up a charred piece of wood. A symbol emerged from under the ash, an X sliced in half. Mulroney said, "They left their mark." Doyle replied, "Same old style, no mistaking it." They didn't need to say the name. The Ku Klux Klan, KKK, didn't require mention to make its presence felt. Mulroney glanced around, visible from the head of the street. That's what they wanted. Doyle nodded, and they wanted Malcolm to get the message. Hurried footsteps behind them made them turn. Eugene stood there, voice trembling. "I saw 3 white men, around 3 in the morning. One said, 'This'll shut him up.'" Doyle asked, "What kind of car?" "Old Chevrolet panel van. No rear plate." Doyle wrote it down, but both knew leads like this rarely led to the real culprits. These groups operated in ways that left no usable traces for the law, only enough to sow fear. Mulroney looked at the cardboard again. The red letters bled like dried blood. "We know where you are." Not a threat, a declaration of power. "They want Harlem to bow," Doyle said. "They want Malcolm silent," Mulroney replied. "And they think this place will just stand still." A young officer approached. "Detectives, what do I put in the report?" Mulroney stared at the scene a few more seconds, then said, "Property damage. Perpetrators unknown." Doyle started to speak, but Mulroney's look cut him off. "You want to write KKK? Want to write assassination threat against Malcolm X? You want a riot by morning?" Doyle said nothing more. Both knew the system wouldn't confront this. Not while Malcolm was the name dividing the nation. Not when one wrong move could turn Harlem into a fire zone. They extinguished the remaining embers, bagged the doll as evidence. The cardboard was set aside separately, but the red writing made the young officer turn his face away. Eugene watched it all from the curb, the look of a man who had seen more than he ever wanted to remember. When the police finished up and prepared to leave at 6:47, Doyle said, "If Bumpy Johnson hears about this before we do." Mulroney answered immediately, "Then the 5 who left this thing are already dead." Doyle looked at Mosque No. 7, at the still smoking cross. "You think they're targeting Malcolm specifically?" "No," Mulroney said. "They're targeting Harlem. Malcolm's just the spark." He closed his notebook and stepped into the car. But he knew the most important thing wasn't in the report. This wasn't ending here. The half-burned cross wasn't just a sign of hatred, it was an invitation to war. And when that war reached Malcolm X, there would be one other man who heard it first of all. Bumpy Johnson. Looking at the scene, Mulroney said, just one thing. On December 3rd, 1963, Malcolm X was at the most dangerous point in his career. He had just left the Nation of Islam, losing the protective network that once surrounded him. His former comrades now saw him as a traitor. The FBI shadowed his every step. Threatening letters arrived at his home more frequently than before. And most importantly, unfamiliar faces kept appearing outside Mosque No. 7 and his house on West 97th Street. Malcolm knew he was being watched, but didn't yet know who was behind it. Not NOI, not the FBI, but a group few thought still existed in New York, the Northern KKK. For years, people believed the KKK was only strong in the South. But in the early 1960s, a few white extremist cells had secretly formed in Queens and Brooklyn. They didn't march or wear white robes. They met in old warehouses, worked day jobs as laborers, and only showed their true faces at night. One such group operated out of a warehouse at 221 Ashford Street, Brooklyn. On the evening of November 29, 1963, 15 members gathered there. They spread numerous articles about Malcolm X across the table, pieces where he criticized NOI, where he spoke about free speech, where he stressed black people must step confidently out of old frameworks. Those words made them see Malcolm as a direct threat. "He's uncontrolled now," said Raymond Henderson, the group's leader. "He wants to talk to white people. He wants to expand his influence. If we don't stop him, he'll create a new movement." The group agreed they had to act first. They discussed for over 2 hours and reached consensus to warn Harlem. They had to target the one person Harlem valued most. Malcolm X became the target. Henderson drew up a list of candidates for the action team. 5 names were selected: Raymond Henderson, Paul Whitmore, Henry Cobb, Gerald Knox, and Clyde Pearson. 5 men with prior records of assaulting black people, firebombing black churches in Brooklyn, and escaping conviction thanks to all-white juries. Cobb would surveil Malcolm at his home. Pearson would watch Mosque No. 7. Knox would monitor his speaking schedule. Whitmore would prepare the message, cross, rope, doll. Henderson would command and personally oversee Malcolm at the Audubon Ballroom. In the days that followed, Malcolm was constantly tailed. When he left home at 7 o'clock, an old van followed closely for several blocks. When he appeared at Mosque No. 7 in the afternoon, Cobb stood across the entrance, pretending to read a newspaper but never taking his eyes off Malcolm. When Malcolm arrived at the Audubon Ballroom to prepare for his December 9th speech, Henderson watched for a long time, noting his arrival and departure times, the number of guards present, the emergency exits. They wanted to know not just where Malcolm went, but who stood beside him, who opened doors for him, who could be seen as interfering. According to their records, from November 29th to December 2nd, Malcolm was surveilled at least 8 times. All of it calculated. They didn't want to kill Malcolm immediately. They wanted to publicize fear. Burning the cross was step 1. In Henderson's words, it was silencing Harlem with just one name. On the night of December 2nd, Henderson held a final meeting before executing the plan. He pointed at Malcolm's photo. "To stop black people, you stop their voice. He is that voice." The other 4 agreed completely. They didn't care about ideology, debate, or politics. They just needed one black symbol to fall in order to send a message across the entire city. The group decided to act within 48 hours, and in the early hours of December 3rd, 1963, they brought the burning cross and the doll to the front of Mosque No. 7. To them, it was a warning. To Harlem, it was a declaration of war. And to Malcolm, it was the moment he was turned into the symbol they wanted to destroy in front of everyone. What they didn't know was that their action had named another man, the one man in the city they should never have touched. Bumpy Johnson, 8:15 a.m., December 3, 1963, in his office on 128th Street. Bumpy Johnson picked up the phone after the third ring. Illinois Gordon reported. KKK sent a message to Malcolm X. Bumpy went silent, the kind of silence that anyone who knew him understood. A storm was forming. Mosque No. 7, half-burned cross, doll hung by the neck. Bumpy hung up immediately. No further questions. Malcolm X was the voice Harlem needed, the man who said what the whole community didn't dare say. Bumpy had once promised Elijah Muhammad if Malcolm ever got into trouble, he would protect him. But the real reason ran deeper. Threatening Malcolm meant threatening Harlem. And if Harlem was challenged, only one man would answer. At 8:33, Bumpy arrived at Mosque No. 7. NYPD officers stepped aside as he walked in, as if they knew this matter no longer belonged to them. On the concrete lay the half-burned cross, the hanged doll, red painted symbols like a declaration of war. Bumpy bent down and picked up 3 cigarette butts, 3 different brands, signs of a hasty gathering. A steel lighter had been dropped, engraved with the letters CP. Under the steps were rubber-soled work boots prints, gasoline poured in a precise arc, the exact style warehouse workers used when torching property. Every detail pointed to one thing, the Northern KKK, not the white-robed Alabama kind, but secret cells in New York's industrial boroughs. Leaving the scene, Bumpy immediately called Joey O'Brien, a bartender on 125th Street, who met at 221 Ashford Street last Friday night. 10 minutes later, Joey called back, 5 white guys, regulars at warehouse 221 Ashford, Henderson, Whitmore, Cobb. 3 first names emerged. Bumpy needed confirmation. A Puerto Rican cab driver he had helped years earlier said he had driven Henderson and 2 others from Queens to Brooklyn in the early hours of November 29th in a van without a rear plate. A white woman in Bushwick recognized Paul Whitmore immediately from a photo. Her ex-husband had once dragged her into a KKK meeting and beaten her when she objected. Jerry Tife, Morano, a small-time arms dealer, confirmed Gerald Knox had asked to buy explosive materials. Marcus Cole brought the final piece. Clyde Pearson, warehouse worker at 221 Ashford Street, matching the CP on the lighting. Bumpy had picked up 5 complete names: Raymond Henderson, Paul Whitmore, Henry Cobb, Gerald Knox, Clyde Pearson. The 5 behind the message to Malcolm, no doubt remained. At 10 a.m., Bumpy gathered his 4 most trusted men, Illinois Gordon, Willie Lee, Quick Jackson, Marcus Cole. He laid 5 photos on the table. They wanted to send a message. Fine. Now it's our turn. No killing right away. They broke Harlem's spirit with fear. We'll break each one with the very thing they sowed. Tasks were assigned quickly. Illinois would handle direct confrontation. Willie Lee would monitor movements. Quick Jackson would infiltrate, sow confusion. Marcus Cole would gather, analyze, and lock down final intel. The plan, within 10 days, dismantle the entire KKK cell before they could touch Malcolm X. The war had officially begun. As he left the room, Bumpy turned back to Mosque No. 7 and looked at the half-burned cross. He stood still and said, "They think they sent a message. They're about to receive one of their own." 11:30 a.m., December 3, 1963. In the office at the corner of 128th Street and St. Nicholas Avenue, Bumpy Johnson spread 5 files across the dark wooden table. The 5 who had dared send a message to Malcolm X. He pointed to the first, Raymond Henderson, Brooklyn cell leader, who had participated in burning a black church in 1959. but escaped conviction because the jury found insufficient evidence. The second, Paul Whitmore, a technician skilled at making pipe bombs fired from a machine shop for bringing explosives to work. The third, Henry Cobb, with a prior conviction for severely beating a young black man at East River Park in 1961. The fourth, Gerald Knox, truck driver, in charge of transporting materials for the group. And finally, Clyde Pearson, warehouse employee, tasked with tailing Malcolm X. Each photo was laid down like a sentence waiting to be carried out. Marcus Cole stood beside him with a brief report. They meet twice a week at Warehouse 221 Ashford Street, Brooklyn. Always late, around after 11 p.m. No phone use, only face-to-face. Bumpy nodded. They chose Malcolm. That means they chose death. None of the four remaining men reacted. They had heard that line in different ways at different times. Each time a criminal group vanished from Harlem. This time the target was the KKK, and the stakes were no longer warnings. Bumpy began outlining the plan. A 10-day campaign, precise as a battlefield map. Days 1 and 2, surveillance. Cut all their communications. Don't let them call each other. Don't let them prepare. He moved to the next phase. Days 3 and 4, destroy their tools. Bombs, gasoline, materials, everything disappears. His finger passed over each of the 5 photos in turn. Days 5 and 6, break their spirit. No killing. Make them panic. Make them doubt each other. Days 7 and 8, force them to expose themselves. They'll have to meet, and they'll think only they know about the meeting. Bumpy placed his hand on Raymond Henderson's photo. Days 9 and 10, eliminate the entire cell. Leave not one alive. Illinois Gordon clenched his fist slightly, as if already prepared for his part. Willie Lee leaned against the wall, silent but sharp-eyed. Quick Jackson gave a small nod, while Marcus Cole noted every detail without missing a word. Bumpy looked at each man and delivered the group's ultimatum, the one sentence that could not be deviated from. Not one of them gets to touch Malcolm, and not one of them leaves New York. The air in the room thickened, as if every path for those 5 KKK men had just been sealed right then and there. Bumpy gathered the files, stacked the 5 photos, then pulled open a drawer and took out another photo. Malcolm X, holding his young daughter, a rare smile few ever saw. He held it in his hand for a few seconds, his eyes not angry, only certain, the certainty of a man who knew he was about to do something he could not back away from. They want to silence a father, he said quietly. I'll silence them first. Outside the window, Harlem buzzed as it always did at noon, but the room was so quiet, you could hear Marcus's pen pause mid-page. The 10 days began from that moment, and none of the 5 men whose images lay on the table understood that their clock had already started ticking. December 3rd to 4, 1963, Harlem. Marcus Cole started with the white truck that had appeared in front of Mosque No. 7. He tailed it from Lenox Avenue at 6 a.m., keeping just enough distance to stay undetected. The truck crossed Harlem, merged onto Queens Boulevard, through gray industrial streets, then suddenly turned onto 58th Avenue. Marcus stopped behind a train station, watched the truck enter an abandoned warehouse, the rolling metal door lifted just high enough for the vehicle to pass. He photographed the fake plate, noted arrival and departure times, number of people entering and exiting, then slipped away in the early morning mist. Every movement was captured with a small camera hidden inside his coat. Meanwhile, Willie Lee kept watch outside Malcolm X's home on West 97th Street. On the first morning, as Malcolm walked his daughter to school, Willie spotted a man standing across from Central Park West. The man leaned against a lamppost, eyes following Malcolm's steps. Willie noted his face, then compared it to the photo Bumpy had given him. It was Henry Cobb. By noon, Cobb returned, this time carrying an old camera. He photographed Malcolm from afar, then hurried across the street, as if afraid of being seen. That evening, he appeared a third time, hiding in the shadow of a tree, watching the house. 3 times in one day, not routine surveillance. Willie sent all the images to Marcus, then stayed there, silent like a guarding statue. Up in northern Harlem, near 138th Street, Illinois, Gordon tailed Gerald Knox's vehicle from Sunrise. When Knox stopped on a quiet street corner, Illinois approached, opened the trunk. Knox's hands shook as he complied. Inside were new ropes, iron bars, 2 homemade grenades, several cans of gasoline, and a bag of flammable materials, all arranged for the kind of work they had done many times in Brooklyn. Illinois looked at Knox, not angry, just the look of someone who already knew the answer. Close it. Knox thought he was about to die, but Illinois only leaned close to his ear and said one sentence, "Take this fear back and report it." Then he walked away, no beating, no capture, no killing, letting him live. That was Bumpy's sharpest weapon. On the night of December 4th, Marcus followed Clyde Pearson from Brooklyn back to Harlem. Pearson left warehouse 221 Ashford Street, drove to the Audubon Ballroom where Malcolm often spoke. He stood outside for nearly 45 minutes, pacing back and forth, measuring every position, as if calculating escape routes, attack angles. Near midnight, Paul Whitmore appeared. Marcus hid in the shadows, snapping photos continuously. Pearson took a small package wrapped in newspaper from Whitmore. Then the two left in different directions. Marcus didn't need to open it to know what it was. Whitmore was notorious in the white underworld for making pipe bombs, and Pearson was the one tailing Malcolm closest. By the end of the second day, all evidence, photos, times, routes were laid on Bumpy's table. He examined each one slowly, but with eyes sharp as a scalpel. Cobb photographing Malcolm walking his child to school. Knox transporting material. Pearson measuring the Audubon Ballroom's entrances and exits. Whitmore supplying equipment. Henderson coordinating from behind. This was no longer surveillance, no longer a warning. This was preparation for an attack. When Bumpy set the final photo down, he spoke not to threaten but to confirm what he had seen over 2 days. They're not just following, they're counting every step Malcolm takes. December 5th and 6th, 1963, the campaign moved into the phase. Bumpy's inner circle called strike for strike to make the enemy understand that death was standing right behind them, waiting only for one wrong breath to fall. On the afternoon of the 5th, Quick Jackson started in the Bronx, where Raymond Henderson kept a small garage behind an old brick row on Longfellow Avenue. Quick used a thin metal strip to jimmy the lock. The garage was dark and smelled of chemicals. Inside, Quick shone his flashlight and immediately saw a thick coil of rope soaked in pine tar hanging on an iron hook. He pulled it down, sniffed, exactly the type used in Southern KKK lynchings, but here modified to bear heavier weight. On the table nearby was a photo of Malcolm X with a red X scrawled violently across his face, the strokes jagged, as if the drawer had been drinking while planning murder. Quick photographed every detail, every corner of the wall, and quietly left. No trace left, as if no one had ever entered that garage. Night fell over the Bronx. Bars on White Plains Road began to fill. Henderson stumbled out of one near 11 o'clock, still reeking of liquor, plastic cup in hand, half finished. He staggered along the sidewalk, unaware that two figures had detached from the crowd behind him, matching his pace. When he turned into a dark alley shortcut home, two hands like vices pulled him into a black sedan waiting curbside. Henderson couldn't scream as a black hood went over his head. The car sped off in seconds. He was dragged into an abandoned warehouse on Brook Avenue. Flashlights flicked on, not blinding, but enough for him to see four figures standing in the shadows ahead. When the hood was yanked off, Henderson saw the face he had only heard whispered in threats among white men in Brooklyn. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy tilted his head, signaling. Illinois and Willie Lee grabbed Henderson, hauled him up to a wooden beam, and tied his hands with the very rope Quick had found in the garage. The rope tightened around his neck, chafing his skin in seconds. As they lifted him, his body weight pulled the noose tighter, forcing out choked, gasping sounds as he fought for air slipping from his lungs. They let him feel exactly what he had planned for Malcolm, a death without gunfire, without traces, only suffocation and prolonged despair, second by second, like a punishment prepared in advance. Bumpy stood directly below, watching Henderson thrash like an animal hung upside down. He didn't blink. When Henderson began turning purple, Bumpy raised a hand. Illinois lowered him. He collapsed onto the concrete floor, gasping like someone pulled from a flood, tears and snot mixing together. Bumpy crouched down, his voice low, but carrying through the empty warehouse. "I just showed you what Malcolm would feel if I didn't step in." Henderson trembled like he had a fever. Don't kill me." Bumpy didn't answer. He asked only one question. "When's your next meeting?" Henderson swallowed hard, struggling to speak. "Tomorrow night, night of the 6th, we meet, to plan." "Plan what?" To bomb Malcolm's speech, the 9th, at Audubon Ballroom." The warehouse went still. Bumpy looked at Marcus. "Write it down." Marcus raised his camera and took one single shot. Henderson on the floor, rope marks still visible on his neck. Not for bragging. Bumpy didn't brag. The photo was only proof, when it was all over, why these men had to pay. After Henderson regained enough sense to realize he was still alive, Illinois dragged him to the car. They drove him to Mullally Park, a small park near Grand Concourse, where yellow streetlights cast a sickly glow on dew-covered swings. They dropped him on a wooden bench, unbound, ungagged, just left him there, panting like someone escaped from hell. Bumpy didn't step out of the car. He only rolled down the window and looked at Henderson one last time. "Go tell your buddies," he said, voice low but sharp as a blade. "Harlem's awake now." The car rolled away, leaving Raymond Henderson shaking in the park, understanding that from this moment, the hunt had reversed, and the hunter was now the one being hunted. December 7th and 8th, 1963, the Brooklyn KKK network began cracking from the inside, not with guns, but with fear spreading across Ashford Street, Jamaica Avenue, and Bushwick. The blow Henderson took 2 days earlier didn't just bring him down, it opened the door for Bumpy Johnson to smash every remaining link. First was Paul Whitmore, the bomb maker considered the technical brain of the Brooklyn cell. On the night of December 7th, Willie Lee slipped into Whitmore's tool shed behind his rundown house on Jamaica Avenue. Inside was enough explosive, slow-burning fuse, and homemade material to demolish a small building. But when Whitmore opened the door the next morning, he froze as if electrocuted. All the explosives had been doused with diluted seawater acid, a mixture that rendered them not only useless but also foul-smelling and mildly caustic to the touch. Every wire was neatly cut, every screw removed, and rearranged into an X shape on the concrete floor. On the wall, in black marker, a small note pinned with a single nail read, "It won't be your bomb that explodes. It'll be you." Whitmore stood trembling, eyes darting around the room as if someone might be hiding behind the shelves. He understood. Someone had entered, destroyed everything in minutes, and left without a sound. He was no longer the master of explosives. He had become the one about to explode from within. The second was Henry Cobb, the one who specialized in shadowing Malcolm X's every step. Marcus Cole took the job of breaking his spirit. Over 36 hours, Marcus tailed Cobb from Ashford Street to Manhattan, then from Manhattan to Bushwick. Cobb went to the supermarket. Marcus stood at the end of the aisle. Cobb stepped into a bar. Marcus sat in the corner. Cobb walked through the park. Every time he turned, a shadow stood motionless in his peripheral vision. No action, no threat, just presence, silence, relentless persistence bordering on inhuman. On the night of December 7th, Cobb got drunk and fled into an abandoned wine cellar beneath a Bushwick shop, thinking he could escape whoever was following him. But as he descended the wooden stairs, footsteps echoed behind, slow, steady, cold. Cobb spun around. No one there. The footsteps stopped with his breathing, then resumed. He flicked on his flashlight, swept the walls, saw nothing, only dripping water and mildew smell. But Cobb knew someone was there, watching him from the dark. By morning, he fled the cellar in panic, mind so fractured he couldn't tell his own sounds from the phantom ones. He drank non-stop, didn't dare return to Brooklyn, didn't dare contact the group. A wolf reduced to a skeleton of fear. The third was Gerald Knox. On the morning of December 8th, he walked to his truck, parked behind a Bushwick block, to prepare for Action Day. But the truck was no longer intact. Hood popped open, wires cut, spark plugs gone, gas tank empty. The license plate had been removed, not to conceal, but to send a message. "You're not going anywhere." Knox looked around, heart pounding like a drum. He knew this wasn't the police, and if it was Bumpy, he was being watched every step. Rumors spread through the KKK group within hours. Harlem knows our every move. Fear spread faster than any fire Henderson had ever lit. The fourth was Clyde Pearson. Illinois Gordon caught him on the night of December 8th, after Pearson left an old warehouse on Ashford Street. Illinois simply sat him down and forced him to write out the entire plan that Henderson, Whitmore, and Cobb had prepared for December 9th. Pearson shook so badly, the pen fell from his hand twice. He confessed everything: bomb placement, timing, executors, escape routes. When finished, Illinois just nodded and let him go. No threat, no tale. But fear had turned Pearson into an internal detonator, a link ready to betray the rest without any of his group realizing it yet. By the end of December 8th, when Marcus Cole delivered the report to Bumpy's table, everything was as clear as Harlem's evening lights. Whitmore had lost his bomb-making ability. Cobb's psyche had collapsed. Knox had lost his vehicle and couldn't participate. Pearson had fractured and become a knife from within. Henderson, the leader, could only wait. Bumpy looked at the list of 5 names, his finger lightly touching each one. Only one conclusion, spoken like a preordained prophecy. They're no longer a pack of wolves, they're just trembling dogs now. On the night of December 8th, 1963, Raymond Henderson dragged himself to Warehouse 221 Ashford Street, like a man being led to execution. His neck still bore rope marks, his breathing ragged from the fear that hadn't subsided since 2 days earlier. He didn't want to come, but the organization's unwritten rule didn't allow absence, especially not when the Malcolm X operation was entering the action phase. Inside the warehouse were 15 familiar faces of the Brooklyn cell, but today they were all strung tight as piano wire. Henderson stood in the center of the meeting room, yellow light casting his face even paler. When he opened his mouth, his voice was so hoarse, it sounded like a dying man's. "Harlem knows everything." The room erupted. Henderson continued, struggling to control his violently shaking hands. "They know the plan. They know Malcolm's being watched. They know what we're supposed to do on the 9th. One man shot to his feet. "Impossible. We kept absolute secrecy." Henderson shook his head, eyes red from sleepless nights. "There's no secrecy left. Malcolm is already protected." Another threw a beer bottle to the floor. "Protected? By who?" "No I." Henderson looked into the darkness where no one wanted to name the name. "Not no I. Not the FBI. It's Bumpy Johnson." The entire room went dead silent. One single name that made them feel as if they had just opened the door to hell. Henderson swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue. "If we go through with it, they'll burn this place down. Burn all of us." From the end of the table, Gerald Knox, the one who had just lost his truck, jumped up. "What the hell are you saying? We're the Klan. We don't run." But from across, another shot back immediately. "And who took your truck? Me? Or because they've been on your tail for 3 days?" The air in the warehouse thickened. Paul Whitmore, still shaken from his tool shed being destroyed, spoke low but clearly. "They knew my spot. They knew yours. They know this warehouse. Harlem knows everything. We're not safe in New York anymore." Another yelled, "So what? Run? Leave everything. What about Malcolm? We have to finish the job." From the back, Henry Cobb, face hollow from being shadowed to near madness, whispered, "It's not Malcolm anymore. We're not fighting Malcolm. We're fighting Bumpy Johnson." The words landed like a final hammer blow, shattering the group's false bravado. The room split into two clear factions. One side, 7 men wanted to leave New York that very night, convinced that staying meant being hunted to death. The other side, 8 men wanted to strike Malcolm immediately, fast and brutal, to prove the Klan feared no one, not even Harlem or Bumpy Johnson. Both sides looked at Henderson. He was no longer the leader, just a witness to fear. "We vote," one said. Henderson nodded, hands shaking so badly he had to brace against the wall. The vote took place in silence. When the count finished, the result was perfectly even. 8 chose to stay and fight. 7 chose to leave immediately. None realized that from the moment the meeting began, the warehouse had been surrounded from a distance. Across the street, in shadows against the fence, Bumpy Johnson stood with Illinois Gordon, Marcus Cole, Willie Lee, and Quick Jackson. They didn't move in. They didn't need to. They only watched, quietly. Bumpy had known which choice would fall where. The weak would run, the foolish would stay. And only the 8 inside the warehouse had chosen the path that surely led to death, even if they still didn't grasp that death had been sealed the moment they planted the burning cross in front of Mosque No. 7. When the 7 left the warehouse, rushing to their cars to head toward the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, Bumpy spoke softly, his voice deep, slow, and colder than December wind. 8 chose death, enough for Harlem to send its message. His shadow stretched long across the pavement, and the war moved into a phase with no turning back for any of the 8 who had just voted to stay. On the night of December 9th, 1963, Brooklyn's sky was covered in thick black, and no one on the street knew that in just minutes, that quiet place would become the epicenter of a night the New York KKK would never forget. In the darkness behind Warehouse 221 Ashford Street, Willie Lee and Quick Jackson moved like 2 breathless shadows. They carried industrial gasoline cans taken from the docks, the thick kind used for heavy machinery. They poured gasoline along the warehouse walls, slipped it through door cracks, doused the old oil drums the KKK had stacked inside. None of them carried guns. None wanted gunfire. Bumpy had forbidden it. "No one dies by our hand," he said. And the truth that night was the KKK had stored explosives in the warehouse. They had created their own detonator. They had chosen their own place of death. Bumpy only stood back, letting everything unfold according to the logic of fanatics who were also fools. Inside the warehouse, the 8 remaining after the fateful vote gathered around the iron table, trembling. Raymond Henderson sat in the corner, hands clutching his head, the rope marks on his neck, a reminder that death had already touched him days earlier. None in the group fully understood what had happened to him, but his terrified eyes were enough to keep them all awake. Paul Whitmore, the bomb maker, tried to assemble a new pipe bomb from leftover scraps, but since Willie had destroyed his tool shed, he couldn't find any intact material. He twisted slow fuse, tried to reattach screws, tried to connect contact points on the detonator, but his hands shook as if holding a venomous snake. Gerald Knox looked out the window every 5 minutes. He was afraid, not of Malcolm, not of the police, but of the vague shadow Henderson had brought back, the shadow of Bumpy Johnson, the man they had thought was just a rumor in Harlem's gangster circles. Now that name had become a nightmare for the entire KKK group that still thought itself the Hunter, and Henry Cobb, still unrecovered from 2 days of Marcus Cole shadowing him like a ghost, flinched at every gust of wind rattling the door. His eyes darted constantly around the room as if someone stood behind every shelf. He began muttering to himself, words no one understood. None of them still believed this was a mission for the cause. They were just 8 men trying to convince themselves they still controlled the situation, but it all collapsed when the first explosion sounded. Just one spark, just one wrong touch. And the pipe bomb Whitmore was assembling detonated prematurely in his hands. He screamed, rolled into the pile of oil drums. Flames erupted as if rising from the ground, swallowing the oil-slicked floor. Henderson jumped up, Knox backed against the wall. Cobb stumbled as he ran toward the back door. The fire spread too fast, fast enough that anyone watching knew no outside hand needed to intervene. This was fire created by the KKK themselves with their gasoline, oil, bombs, and wiring. Outside, Willie Lee watched the flames catch from the door crack and turned to Quick Jackson. "No need for anything else," he said. "They did it themselves." Quick just nodded, eyes following the panicked figures running in the flickering light. Across the street, Bumpy stood motionless like a statue. He didn't smile, he didn't speak. He only watched the fire turning the warehouse into an incinerator. He knew that if he stepped in, even for a second, all the effort of 10 days would become a murder committed by him. But this wasn't something he did. This was the consequence of their own actions. They had gathered the explosives, they had planned it, they had caused the explosion, and they would pay for their stupidity and hatred. Henderson rushed to the front door, pounding the handle like a madman, but the door was locked from outside. Not with a new lock, just the old bolt the KKK used to secure the warehouse during meetings. Bumpy had only slid it shut. He didn't trap anyone. They had trapped themselves. At the back door, 3 broke the latch and ran out like animals with singed fur. But as they crossed the threshold, they saw Marcus Cole standing there in the darkness. He didn't block their path. He just stood and watched. And as they ran past him, he did nothing but turn to follow them with his eyes. That was the only mercy Harlem granted them. Mercy, but to live in fear for the rest of their lives. Inside the warehouse, the flames reached the ceiling. Whitmore rolled on the floor, screaming as oil caught his clothes. Knox punched the window until his hands bled, but the iron bars didn't budge. Cobb curled up in a corner, muttering, "He knows, he knows. He saw me." Henderson slumped to the floor, staring at the flames with the look of a man realizing his fate had been decided the day he stepped into Harlem. Fire tore through walls, burning away the racist slogans they had painted over months. The warehouse became a giant torch in the Brooklyn night. The blaze reflected on the windows of opposite apartments, making residents think the whole block was burning. At 1:42 a.m., an oil drum exploded, producing the final massive boom, like the end of all life inside. When the NYPD arrived, the fire had begun to die down, leaving only blackened steel frames and the lingering smell of oil in the wind. They inspected, noted, and quickly concluded: explosion due to illegal storage of flammable and explosive materials. In the files, this KKK cell simply became an extremist group that blew itself up one cold night. The FBI opened a file for 36 hours, reviewed a few reports, then closed it quietly. Internal activity leading to spontaneous detonation. No press conference, no follow-up, no arrests, because none were needed. By dawn on December 10th, Warehouse 221 Ashford Street was nothing but gray-black ash steaming in the cold. No more white figures stood guard outside Malcolm's door. The KKK in New York disintegrated in a single night, so fast that even the surviving members never dared speak of it again, for fear Harlem would hear. They vanished, as if they had never existed. Bumpy watched the ash blow in the wind, then turned away without a word, because that night, Harlem's history spoke for him. March 1964. Harlem, in the interview room of the New Amsterdam news office. Light fell on the wooden table, where Bumpy Johnson sat across from a young reporter clutching a notebook, hands trembling slightly from nerves. The reporter didn't dare look straight at the man in front of him for too long. Finally, after a few seconds of silence, he spoke, "Mr. Johnson, there are rumors that you were behind the destruction of a KKK branch in 10 days to protect Malcolm X. Do you have any comment?" Bumpy didn't answer. He braced his arms on the chair, eyes gazing out the window where Harlem's noon sun cast long strips of light like cuts. He neither denied nor confirmed, just the silence of a man who had stood too many times at the crossroads of law and shadow to still believe in absolute boundaries. The reporter waited, then asked again, "Do you regret it, if what people say is true?" This time Bumpy turned. He looked straight at the young man and spoke slowly, each word weighed carefully. "I don't regret what I did. I regret that Harlem needed me to do it." The room fell silent. The reporter gripped his pen tighter. Bumpy's voice stayed level, no rise or fall, continuing as if reciting a memory long stored away. "It wasn't revenge," he said. "It was balance. When one side steps on another's neck, someone has to stand up to restore equilibrium, not because they enjoy it, but because no one else will." The reporter swallowed. He asked the question only older hands in the profession would dare. Why Malcolm X? Bumpy leaned back, his gaze growing heavy, as if pulled down by all of Harlem standing behind him. Malcolm was the only voice that made black people believe in tomorrow, he said. He gave them hope, gave them reason to stand tall. Touch him. Bumpy paused, "And you touch all of Harlem." The reporter opened his notebook, shaking more than before. "Mr. Johnson," he asked, "if you really did what people claim, do you think it was justice or just a kind of frontier law?" The question seemed to shrink the room, but Bumpy only tilted his head. Justice, he said. When the law stays silent, justice has to find another voice. The reporter tried to keep his composure, but his chest pounded. He knew Bumpy wasn't talking about guns, violence, or revenge. He was talking about the void society left, and people like him were forced to fill. "Are you afraid the KKK will come back?" the reporter asked, the last question on his list, but he knew it was the most important. Bumpy gave a soft laugh, not joyful, but a sigh given shape. "After December 1963, he said, the KKK never came back to Harlem." "Because of the police?" the reporter asked. "No, because of the FBI." "No." Bumpy placed both hands on the table, leaning slightly forward. His eyes no longer looked at the reporter. They looked through the wall, through the streets, through Harlem's history. "They didn't come back," he said, "because Harlem had a man named Ellsworth Raymond Johnson." No one in the room spoke another word. The reporter lowered his pen. He knew this interview would never be published, not because he didn't want to, but because the paper, the police, the city of New York, would never let the public read these words. Bumpy Johnson's statements were too real, too sharp, too dangerous to print. When Bumpy stood and left the room, the door closed behind him. But in the reporter's mind, his final words echoed on like a warning, a confession, and a declaration from a Harlem that once had to defend itself not only from racists, but from the silence of the system. Justice has to find another voice. And on the night of December 9th, 1963, that voice belonged to Bumpy Johnson. If you want to continue exploring the untold noir stories of Harlem, please subscribe so you don't miss any part. See you again on the next journey, where the truth is always sharper than any blade.